Welcome back, guys. I'm here working on the cooling system for the Ferrari today. I'm trying to get it wrapped up. I only have, give or take 24 hours to put an episode together since I uploaded late on Wednesday, so instead of focusing on production value, I'm actually trying to get something done. Let's see if we can get coolant put into the car today. That way we can run this thing for more than, 30 or 45 seconds. That sounds like a pretty good goal. Let's dive in. Picking up where we left off in the last episode, we built this -20 AN hose that turned out to not quite be flexible enough to fit into the car. I showed you guys some push lock fittings and said perhaps this is a good solution for what we need to accomplish, but we didn't have the fittings on hand. But today we've got some huge -20 push lock fittings that'll fit an 1.25 inch radiator hose. Now, as a quick recap, a push lock fitting will work with normal AN bungs. However, instead of having a hose end for use with braided line, it's got a normal hose barb on the end for use with rubber radiator hose and hose clamps. That should give us the flexibility we need, but there is one drawback. These push lock fittings have a huge radius in contrast to the -20 hose ends that we used in the last episode. I was worried at first that these weren't going to fit in the car. As you guys saw, we're really limited on room. But after a test fit, I'm happy to say everything does clear, if only barely. When getting started, the upper fitting only clears the starter by fractions of an inch, but that's enough in this case. So with the fittings in place, we can kind of get an idea of what shape of hose we need. I think what's going to make the most sense is to try to bend either 90 degrees or maybe a little bit past 90 and travel from here down to the lower fitting. We can technically point it closer, but if we do that, you guys will notice that those fittings start to get really close together, and I don't think we're going to get anything that can jog between those. So let's go to the auto parts store and see what we can find that might bend from here down to there. So I went to my local auto parts store, and they were kind enough to let me wander around behind the counter and look for some hoses that might actually fit, and I brought 2 back to the shop. I thought maybe the jogged hose would clear, but there's no chance. However, the curved hose seems like it's going to fit rather nicely. Another added benefit for anybody doing something like this at home is that if you write down that part number, you have an easily accessible replacement or backup hose at any time. The hose does need a little bit of trimming though, and I went over to the lathe to use my favorite hose cutting trick, only to find out that the curvature of the hose keeps it from clearing the deck. So I just cut it by hand down to the size that we're going to need, and then went to go install it in the car. Now, as mentioned, we do need hose clamps for this job, so instead of some simple worm gear ones, I bought some nice T-bolt clamps just in case you do happen to catch a glimpse of this thing underneath the intake manifold. Installation, of course, is literally as easy as it gets. You just push the hose onto the barbs and then tighten down the hose clamps. We could trim the T-bolts up a little bit to shorten them up and make it look a little bit better, but we can do that a bit later down the road. Given that it is a rubber hose, I think the finished product looks pretty good, and I think this is a good example of how push lock fittings can be used for pretty much anybody wanting to use AN ports on a budget. The only problem is these -20 fittings don't fit any -20 wrenches I have here in the shop. Technically, there are 2 different AN sizes, and I've only got one style of wrench. I don't know why they do this, and it drives me crazy. So we're going to have to come up with a solution. One option is to use my gigantic Hand Tool Rescue adjustable wrench, because it's the only wrench I have that'll open up big enough. But this thing is a bit too big to fit down in the engine bay, and it's not going to work very well for this job. So instead, let's make something. I've got a lot of -16 wrenches lying around, who knows why, so we're going to chop one up and make it fit. I'm going to offset this to one side so that we have a little bit better movement and can flip the wrench to get a little bit more adjustability out of it, because we do have to work within some tight constraints down in the bottom of the engine bay. Admittedly, I winged it. I took this thing over to the bandsaw, chopped it up, and then after just cleaned the edges up with a hand file, but I'm happy to say that it did work rather well. The only downside is this happens to be maybe my worst composed shot ever. Maybe you can see what's going on, or maybe not. But it worked, and it looks good, and we just need to shorten those T-bolts. And for everybody freaking out in the comments right now, no, this is not a permanent solution, it's just a solution. I'm going to come up with something using some Wiggins clamps later down the line. Next on the list before we can fill this thing with coolant is modifying the intercooler. Some of you guys have pointed out that we're going to need a bleed port for this thing, and you're definitely right. While the filler neck is technically higher over here in the corner, it's not going to be enough in order to get the air out of the top of the intercooler itself. Adding a bleed port will solve that problem, so I went out and bought an 1/8" NPT aluminum bung, and I'm going to attach it directly to the water end tank of the intercooler itself. I'm going to put it on the front end of the tank so you can't easily see it from the back of the car to try to keep this thing at least looking somewhat clean, because a port is somewhat unsightly. I got it all welded up and it doesn't seem to leak any water, and honestly, if you're wearing a welding mask, I think this thing looks pretty good from across the shop. In any case, the plug works well, so it's time to get this thing installed and start filling this thing up with coolant. And to be clear, by coolant, I mean distilled water. Now, there is a huge debate about whether you should use tap water, distilled water, coolant, or any other fluid inside of your system, and there are pros and cons to each of them. I'm not going to be running typical antifreeze coolant in this car for two major reasons. One, because I'm in Southern California and it doesn't freeze here, and two, because you're not allowed to on a racetrack. It makes the track surface slippery and it's hard to clean up if you happen to spill any. For that purpose, we'll use some sort of additive like water wetter, but for now, because we're definitely going to drain both of these cooling systems before we take this car out anywhere, water will be just fine. With the charge air system largely filled, I moved on to filling the engine with water. There will be a lot of bleeding and burping in order to get all of the air out of this system, but by cracking the front radiator hoses, it seems to be working well so far. Alright, so I've got coolant kind of working its way into the engine. So far, no leaks, which I'm pretty pleased with. I figured I'd be spilling water at least once. I can hear it trickling into the radiator, which is a good sign. The only snag that we're going to hit right this moment for both cooling systems is the fact that we don't have the second PDM mapped yet, so I can't turn on the water pumps and start flowing water and agitating the system and starting to burp it. Both pumps have bleeder ports on them, which is going to help us. We've got lots of ways to bleed the system of air up top. I might need to add a port to the radiator for the engine just because it is so big and does have a high point in it, and I want to make sure we don't just have kind of an air gap in the top of it, but we can cross that road when we get there. That shouldn't be too hard to do. Overall, this is going pretty well. I'm going to see how much more water I can get into the system. We've got almost exactly 2 gallons in the engine cooling system at this point, which is it's a pretty good volume. I imagine there's still a bit left. It's a pretty big radiator. All of the lines are quite large. So I'm going to guess we can probably get another gallon, I would think at least, maybe 2. I don't know, we'll see. I need the pump running to really know though. With that though, we can call the cooling system done, at least for now. All we need is some electronic changes so we can power up those water pumps and cycle the system. That seems like as good a reason as any to get this car back into running shape, so I decided to reinstall the intake manifold and the charge air piping. I've said countless times before, but man, this intake manifold is one of the prettiest pieces on the car. I'm excited each and every time I look at it in the engine bay. With that stuff hooked back up, we're more or less ready to run it again. Although if we want to run it for any extended period of time, we're going to need some radiator fans. After all, this thing will still overheat if we don't have them. Now, plenty of you guys have seen my buddy John's 308 here in the shop, and it's in here for its own upgraded radiator and radiator fans and fan shroud. So we're going to do a quick rough draft on his car, send those parts to Send Cut Send, and then build our own fan shroud. And of course, there's one final thing, that pesky little brass port on the turbo lurking down there in the bottom of the engine bay. This is the coolant outlet, and on the flip side is the coolant inlet, and we have to run coolant through the turbo to keep it cool. We'll have to get a little bit crafty on how to pull that off, but my current plan is to add another junction into our filler neck on the intercooler cooling system. We'll run coolant supply from this point because it should have positive pressure from the water pump, and we will join back into the cooling system after the intercooler so that we're not adding additional hot water to the front side and heating up our charge air temps. But that's just one of many things on a long to-do list, and it's not something we need to worry about just yet. There's a lot of other things that are a lot more important that we can focus on in the meantime. So we've got coolant in both cooling systems. They're not full yet. We got to get that PDM mapped out so we can turn the pumps on and actually bleed these systems. I need to get fans on the front end, and we got to run it again so we can actually make sure that it all works, that we have no leaks and all that kind of stuff. It's all baby steps. We're getting there one step at a time. I know this wasn't the most action-packed episode, but it's all things that need to get done, and I like to show you guys everything that goes into this thing, including the steps that aren't the coolest, such as figuring out stupid rubber couplings instead of braided stuff. Anyways, that's all I've got for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you guys next week in the next episode. Who knows what it's going to be about? Don't forget, subscribe if you haven't. Leave a like. As Superfast Matt says, all hail the algorithm. I'll catch you guys in the next one.